Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing really well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight, because it's getting very, very exciting. We now know that the children are confessing to their parents that they were at the quarry during the night, which can be very, shocking to the parents to realise that their children were 40 minutes away during the night from where they actually lived, and that their sons had seen their friend hanging from the bough of a tree, having hung himself around the neck. So that's quite a shocking revelation. And obviously it would seem that a Bigfoot during the night had taken them to that quarry. So that's an extraordinary story. So let's continue with part 3 of our story. Is this true, Howard? My mother said, tears spilling down her cheeks. Please say it's not true. It just can't be. It is true, Mummy. I'm really sorry. It was dark outside, but I saw a dead man. He had a rope around his neck. He was swinging from a willow tree. So did Martin. We both saw it. We know it was Duncan Hewitt. There was no doubt in my mind about that. I'd recognise him anywhere. I'm sorry to tell you this, Mum. I don't like upsetting you. But it's true. My mother began patting her face with a napkin. Beads of perspiration broke out on her forehead. This is too dreadful for words, she said, clutching her chest. My heart can't stand any more of this bad news. Oh, goodness gracious, what was Duncan Hewitt thinking? Does he even realise what this is going to do to poor Helen when she hears the news? Oh, I could kill the man. Too bad he's already dead. Helen is going to be devastated. This is going to destroy her. How am I going to tell her any of this? I better go and check this out, had I not said my father. I need to verify that Duncan Hewitt is indeed dead. You better not be making any of this up, sons, or there'll be hell to pay, he said, rising from his chair and leaving at once to go to the quarry, to see whether what me and my brother Martin had told him was indeed true. I think he remained reasonably sceptical. I remember his truck took off like a rocket as he left the cabin. Martin and I judiciously decided between us not to tell either of my parents about the creature at the window that had succeeded in hypnotizing us, because we emphatically knew he would not believe a single word of our incredulous story. So if my father thought we were telling porkies, he would go ballistic. He was traditionally old school by nature, abhorred lying of any kind, and was intolerant towards it. And we were always taught to tell the truth, no matter what. Sometimes, when the truth seems unbelievable, it's almost better not to say anything at all, as then, likely, you will be condemned for being a liar, even when you are not. I remember me, my sisters and brothers sat around the breakfast table, rather impatiently, waiting in a haunted kind of trepidation for my father to return from the quarry. No one ate a single thing. No one moved a piece of cutlery, or even tinkled a glass. My mother just stared absent-mindedly into space, as if she was miles and miles away from our table. We sat up with a start, our shoulders tightening, our faces contorting with nervousness, when we heard the sound of my father's truck returning from the quarry, his boots thundering through the house. The sound was not good. It was ominous. When my father entered the kitchen, we all stared directly at his grim face that told us everything we needed to know. My father nodded at my mother, hanging his face in sorrow. It's true, I'm afraid. The children weren't making this up. Duncan Hewitt has hung himself on a tree at the quarry. The silly man! my mother said, bursting into tears. My siblings were gobsmacked by this stunning revelation, as now they knew someone who had committed suicide, and that was not easy to digest for us at the time, especially since we'd all known Duncan Hewitt and liked him very much. "What an idiot," said my father. "What was Duncan thinking? I expect he hung himself because he believes he's responsible for his sister's death. What a tragic waste of life. Why would he do something like this? Silly old fool." I do remember, for years after that strange idiosyncratic sequence of paradoxical events, me and my brother Martin pondered very deeply over everything that had happened to us. We concluded that the Bigfoot had deliberately taken us to the quarry, in a hypnotized trance-like state, so that we would see that Duncan Hewitt was dead, and inform the townsfolk as to his whereabouts. For had we not been at the quarry, it may have been an awfully long period of time before his body was finally recovered, and maybe it would never have been found. I cannot be sure about that. While my grandfather had told us his story, our eyes did not move from his face. We stared at him incredulously. "This is a true story, Grandpa?" I asked. "Really true?" "It's true, all right. There are some things, son, that you never, ever forget, because they have an indelible impression on you, so that no matter how old you become, that memory never gets remotely blurred. Me and my brother Martin, we concluded through the ruminations, as I was telling you, that the Bigfoot had skillfully drawn us out of the cabin that night to lead us to Duncan Hewitt's body. I guess he knew the next morning we would tell our parents about seeing the dead body hanging from the tree, so that the body was easily salvaged. That creature that scared the bejesus out of us never intended to harm us. It just shows you that just because something is intimidating doesn't mean that it means you harm. So the saying, "Don't judge a book by its cover, boys," is very apt in this scenario, said my grandfather, chuckling, as he laughed at his own joke. I must say Duncan Hewitt's wife, Helen, was filled with great gratitude for us discovering the body of her husband, although tragically she never did get over him wantonly taking his life like that. She was mad at him for a while, as you can imagine. Of course, my father was not best pleased that we'd been exploring the quarry at the dead of night, so we did get into trouble for that. We chose not to tell him how we actually ended up in the quarry. We'd have been in the stewing pot if we'd told him what had really happened to us that night, because he'd have never believed a word of it for a moment. In his eyes it would be fanciful thinking, and he thought we were inclined to make up wild stories at the best of times. It was better to tell my father we had got up in the middle of the night to go and play in an abandoned quarry, 40 minutes away from our cabin. The truth is, we would have never done something so silly. But my father was so confounded by what he described as idiosyncratic behaviour on our parts. He blamed me, of course, for the intrepid adventure. He knew Martin was much more prudent than I was, so clearly I was a bad example and influence on my brother. Suffice to say, my other brothers and sisters were not so misled by our story, because they knew that we would not willingly go to the quarry at the dead of night, because we were scared of the dark. We didn't even like going to the outhouse alone. If we needed to answer a call of nature, we always woke up one of our siblings. So they were taken aback by our bizarre, enigmatic behaviour. Me and Martin sagaciously kept storm about everything that happened to us. My father gave all of us a staunch lecture, reminding us that we should never go out in the wild in the middle of the night, or wandering off again like that. Of course, I gave him my solemn word that I never would. "I blame you for this, Howard," said my father. I'm grateful, of course, that the body of Duncan Hewitt was found. But I'm in no doubt that you influenced your brother Martin here to go playing at the quarry in the middle of the night. You've always been inclined to rebellious behaviour, son, and it's got to stop. Do you understand? Yes, Dad, I said to him. So the Bigfoot got you into lots of trouble, I said, even though he was trying to help you. In a manner of speaking, said my grandfather, chuckling. But Mr. Fromage, asked my friend James, I don't understand why poor Mr. Duncan Hewitt hung himself. It wasn't his fault his sister forgot to wear her riding hat. My grandfather rubbed his walrus moustache reflectively. His eyes looked lugubriously sorrowful. Grief is a very distressing thing, young man. There's nothing that can break a man down so hard. It's the pickaxe of our emotions, it is. And if we don't handle it with the utmost of care, it can cut us down quite literally. Have you lost anything you love, James? My grandfather asked him directly. I had a hamster once called Chester, admitted James. The cat ate her. I was so upset about it. I cried for days on end. My mother tried to buy me another hamster, but I didn't want another hamster. I wanted only Chester. Well, there you are then. You understood what it was like to grieve a very sad loss, said my grandfather. James nodded half a dozen times at my grandfather. His eyes became very glassy as he held back tears, as he remembered his little furry friend. We were devastated when Chester was killed. We had a funeral ceremony at our house. He was buried in the backyard. The priest arrived to say some prayers for Chester, said James, tears now rolling down his cheeks. What my husband is trying to tell you, James, my grandmother interjected, as she twisted the wool around her needle and continued to knit. Even though you're absolutely right that it wasn't, Mr. Hewitt's fault that his sister wasn't wearing a riding hat at the time, he felt guilty about it, didn't he? Because she needn't have died had she been wearing her hat. I guess he blamed himself for that. Guilt can eat away at you. That's why he hung himself. It's really, really sad, said James. Poor Mr. Hewitt. It is sad, my grandmother agreed again. It sounds like he was a very good man. Did you ever see the Bigfoot again, Mr. Fromage? Asked James, his eyes widening with eagerness. Yes, I did, as it happens. In another bizarre set of circumstances, you could say, said my grandfather. Believe it or not, once again it was me and Martin who saw him, no one else, which made me think that in some way the elusive creature was willing to show himself to us, and not my other siblings. As to why this was the case, I honestly do not know. You never told me any of this, Howard, said my grandmother, looking very put out. She stiffened. Her slumped posture on the camping chair became significantly straighter. She studied my grandfather sharply through her blue eyes that looked particularly peeved. Why did you keep this from me, Howard? She said, pointing her knitting needle at him accusingly. I can't think why I never told you, Rosa, said my grandfather, raising a bushy, questionable brow that rather reminded me of a white albino caterpillar. I am surprised I never told you, he said obsequiously. I did think I had. I'm sorry about that. You didn't tell me, said my grandmother sharply, unable to hide the prickly annoyance in her voice. I think she liked to believe she knew absolutely everything there was to know about my grandfather, and was proud of it too. I remember there was a quiz once in town as to how well you knew your partner. The couples were asked questions about each other, and my grandparents won first prize. They got all the questions right. The couples were not allowed to see each other's answers, which they would secretly scroll on a miniature chalkboard. They would be asked questions in the quiz like, "What is your partner's favourite meal?" What is his bad habit? Things like that. I know that many people got their answers wrong about their spouses, which highlighted there were things they clearly did not know about their partner, but not my grandmother. Never my grandmother. She proudly boasted that she knew absolutely everything there was to know about my grandfather, and she probably did. Nothing ever got past her beady eyes. I think she liked to think that she was the yin to my grandfather's yang, you could say, and that she could literally finish my grandfather's sentences for him. So realizing there was a story concerning his life she knew nothing about, literally threw her off her perch. She wasn't happy about that at all. "Well, you'd better tell us what happened, hadn't you?" said my grandmother grimly, looking more than a little disgruntled. My grandfather looked rather sheepish and rather bashful after my grandmother had given him a slight scolding, but he rubbed his moustache reflectively and continued along with his story. All eyes were once again pinned on my grandfather, with the same gripping intensity of kids looking at an exciting movie and holding their breaths as they contemplated what was coming next. As usual, my grandfather did not disappoint. My heart did an excited little skip as I pondered what he was going to tell us next, and both my friends did not even dare flinch or move a muscle, as they gladly hung on to my grandfather's every word. I was probably about 12 years old the second time I physically saw the Bigfoot. As usual, me and Martin were hanging around together as we always did. It was the school holidays. My mother was baking. She told us all to scoot. She wanted us out of her way. I think we were hoping we could lick out the cake batter from the bowls, but it was not to be. My mother found with too many of us around in the kitchen, we got annoyingly under her feet. My sisters promptly decided they'd go and visit a girlfriend of theirs in town, who had invited them to celebrate her birthday at her house. So they were going to have tea with her. My other 3 brothers had been given a job painting one of our neighbours' fences. They were thrilled. Our family was going to get 6 chickens for the job, as bartering for jobs was quite commonplace back in the day, and 6 chickens seemed like a very good deal. The more chickens we had, the more free-range eggs, and my mother used eggs for everything. She was a proficient baker, and often bartered some of her baked goods in exchange for other services, or other food produce like milk, honey, curd, butter, cream, and cheese. Me and my brother Martin appeared to be surplus to requirements that morning. We didn't seem to be needed for any respective jobs, although I will hasten to say we were often frequently roped into cutting firewood, in our spare time, to prepare for the long winter in advance. But for some reason our father took pity on us, told us to enjoy ourselves, as we were only young once. We didn't need any further encouragement, and decided to go off to the creek in the wood grove and play around the water there, and that is exactly what we did. It was a particularly hot day. Much of the grass in Appalachia was a little on the yellow side. When you walked across it, it was almost crunchy beneath your feet. That year had been badly scorched from the previous blistering winter. We had not experienced any rain yet, which was a tad unusual for West Virginia. We knew once the rains came, West Virginia would become verdantly lush. So there we were, eagerly sauntering down a rather bumpy dirt road, strewn with pebbles. There weren't many that were asphalted back then. We reached the large cluster of trees that fringed the grove. We kicked the stones on our way to the old creek. The silvery water of the creek twinkled in the morning light, reflecting all the trees on its surface, and it was magnificently beautiful. It was covered with an ancient bridge that had been there since yesteryear, and was badly warped. Much of the wood had rotted away. Me and Martin could balance on the bridge rather precariously, because we were light and agile on our feet. But if you were heavy and ungainly, you might just fall from the bridge straight into the water, if you busted one of those wooden panels, that is. A few of the locals, good with working with their hands, had made plans to fix the bridge, but they had been procrastinating over the project for many years, and nothing was done about it. There was, in fact, a sign on the bridge warning people to keep away. It wasn't safe to use, given the decomposing state of the wood. We threw off our socks and shoes. We couldn't get into that water fast enough, rolled up our chinos above our knees, and paddled around in the water, screaming with excitement as you do. The water was icy cold on our feet, so translucently clear you could see the tiny little fish darting past your feet. Then there were the dragonflies, buzzing above the water, like miniature hovering silver aircraft. And we noticed a couple of frogs hopping around. We eagerly gave them chase, but couldn't catch them. I did manage to catch one for half a second, but sadly it slid out of my hand, and both me and Martin cracked up laughing, as they kept jumping so high up in the air. All of a sudden I was struck with an unsettling feeling that we were being watched. The feeling crawled down my spine, as if someone had tipped an ice-cold cube of ice down my shirt. I realized my brother Martin was hit with a similar sense of foreboding, that we were not alone. We forgot about chasing the frogs, soberly scrutinizing the trees with all our might, while standing with the water up to our knees in the creek. I think we felt a tad foolish when we realized that nothing was there. "I was sure someone was watching us," I told my brother. We persuaded ourselves that nothing was there and continued frolicking away in the water, having the fun of our lives, this time trying to catch one of the dragonflies, which I hasten to say was a fruitless endeavour, worse than trying to catch a frog. The feeling of being watched never abated, not even for a second, so we were always apprehensively glancing over our shoulders, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching us. It wouldn't have been impossible for us to see a local or someone going for a stroll, maybe even with their dog, but nothing was there. Everything became ominously silent, eerily quiet, you could say. Even the bird song had become very mute. My brother looked at me earnestly and said gingerly in a whisper, "I think we should go back to the cabin. Something feels off around here, don't you think? I can't shake off the feeling that someone's watching us, and it's giving me the creeps." Before I had a chance to agree with my brother, a vision simply popped into my head, demanding my swift attention, as if someone had shoved a photograph in my hands that I was forced to look at. I've never been the type of person to have visions or prognostications of any kind, but at this moment a lucid picture of old Mrs. Alice Montgomery, lying in her yard next to her chicken coop, in a state of unconsciousness, trespassed into my mind with a pronounced sense of knowing. I have no idea where the vision came from at that moment, but I saw it explicitly in my head. I knew unequivocally, with a profound sense of certainty, that Alice Montgomery was in dreadful trouble and needed our help. In that moment my brother said to me, "I don't know how to explain this to you, Howard, but I think old Mrs. Montgomery has had a nasty fall. She needs our help. A picture of her came into my mind. I could see her clearly. I could see her so clearly." It would seem the two of us, paradoxically, had been having exactly the same vision. Seconds later, as we were about to leave the creek for Alice Montgomery's home, we saw the Bigfoot, standing there in the trees watching us, and I knew at once that that was the same creature that had taken us to the quarry that night, when we'd witnessed Duncan Hewitt hanging from a tree branch. The Bigfoot looked at us through deep-set, dark, treacle-coloured eyes that were not yellow because it was daylight, but once again we were drawn into his eyes and were flooded with images of old Alice Montgomery, lying there outside the chicken coop. I will never forget the Bigfoot, and seeing him in the cold light of day, and even though he was remarkably intimidating, he was not nearly as scary as the face we'd seen at the window on that inauspicious night when his fortuitous presence filled us with fear. "What did the Bigfoot look like, Grandpa?" I interjected. "Well, at first, me and my brother just saw this shadowy, dark, obscure humanoid silhouette standing against the tree," said my grandfather. "It would have been easy to overlook, to disregard, to think you were just looking at another tree. But when you scrutinized the figure clearly, you could see a tree it most certainly was not. The creature was covered with long, flowing dark hair. It had overlong arms that trailed beyond his knees. He had huge, substantial tree-trunk-sized legs, and a distinctive bullet-shaped head that folded into a ponderous pair of large shoulders. The neck was incredibly short. I remember being drawn into his human-like face, and those eyes were gripping. I'll never forget those eyes. They looked right through you, they did. They could draw you right in, suck you in. When we saw him, after he downloaded those images of Alice Montgomery into our head, he simply nodded at us somberly and glided away. He never spoke to us telepathically or anything, but we knew that he was sending us to Alice Montgomery. Me and my brother hurriedly put on our shoes and socks, eagerly sprinting to Alice Montgomery's property, like two flying bullets. Now, Mrs. Montgomery was an 89-year-old woman, and back then I considered her to be decrepit and old. But now the irony is, I'm almost as old as she was back then. She had very successfully raised a family of over 11 kids, all robustly healthy, who were grown up and had children of their own, who were also now grown up. Her husband had died 2 years earlier, after having caught a devastating bout of pneumonia, after a brutally hard winter, but he lived to be about 87 years old, so he had a remarkably good innings. You see, Mrs. Montgomery knew quite a bit about the afterlife, because she had physically died when she was 14 years old. They said she was dead for 10 minutes. She came back claiming she had never wanted to return to her human body, but she had been told it wasn't her time yet. I remember at the funeral for her husband, she was wearing bright clothes and smiling, as if she'd won the lottery, because she said her husband Barney was now at home with God, and the other side was so much better than our earth. Mrs. Montgomery was greatly loved by the local community. People naturally looked out for each other, and in her advancing years, she still refused any help. She was a fiercely independent and proud woman. The trouble is, when you're as old as she was, and you're living on your own, with no family around to support you, and something bad happens to you, you cannot always call for help. No one was there to help Mrs. Montgomery after she succumbed to her nasty fall, except, of course, a Bigfoot, whom I personally believe was watching over the old woman without even her knowledge. When we arrived at Mrs. Montgomery's property, there she was, like she'd been in our vision, lying on the ground outside the chicken coop. But someone had generously covered her with large leaves to keep the sun and flies off her face, which was a jolly good thing to do. The hens were liberally scattered all over the place, pecking the ground, completely oblivious to the state of their owner. We noticed her head had been carefully placed on a pillow of soft dirt, but when we got to her she was relatively unresponsive. It turned out she'd tripped and fallen over, hitting her head against a concrete brick. She was concussed, so she was quickly taken to hospital, where she made a full and complete recovery. I remember my mother saying to us, "You saved Mrs. Montgomery's life! How nice of you boys to look in on her! I've raised such thoughtful, God-fearing boys who care so much about the elderly people in our community." I wish I could say that that was true, but that day we had selfishly only thought of entertaining ourselves at the creek and looking in on elderly people was the last thing on our minds. We got so much undeserving praise and gratitude for our apparent kindness from the locals, which was entirely undeserved. Mrs. Montgomery's grown-up children brought me and Martin our own mountain bikes. They believed unequivocally we'd saved their mother's life. The truth is the Bigfoot had watched over the old woman when we did not, and when she had fallen, he had covered her up with leaves and kept the heat off her body, and it turned out he was right not to have moved her at all. According to the medical doctor, who was called out onto the scene, who thought we'd been very clever to leave her as she was. Ostensibly, if we hadn't found her in time, she would surely have died. Once again, me and Martin chose not to divulge that a Bigfoot had fed our mind with the information that it informed us Mrs. Montgomery needed our help. Let's just say that kind of tale seemed outrageously absurd, but we knew it was true. Mrs. Montgomery had been in a fragile state. I'm so glad we found her. I hasten to say she had no memory of the event, beyond just falling over and blacking out. She told us when her family had left home, and after her husband died, she always felt something was watching over her to keep her safe. My guess it was the male Bigfoot, who may have subconsciously communicated with her that he had her back, and he would always check up on her, which is what he must have done. "That is a remarkable story, Howard," said my grandmother. "I cannot believe you never told me about it. I'm sure the children here really enjoyed it. Anyway, you've had your fill of stories tonight, kids, so it's time to go to bed. Do you still want to sleep in the tent tonight, or are you a bit scared after Howard's stories?" she asked us. "Because if you are, you can sleep in the house. There's no shame in that at all." My grandparents lived in a really nice red-bricked home in McDowell County, with sash windows, a grey slate roof, and 3 chimneys. It had once belonged to a coal mining manager, but he sold it to my grandparents for a song when the coal mining industry went into decline, and he moved away to greener pastures, I suspect. "We're not scared, Mrs. Fromage," said James boldly. "We're excited about sleeping out in the tent." It was a perfect starry night, let me tell you. It was late spring, teetering into early summer, but the weather was pleasant, and Appalachia was lovely and green. We'd enjoyed some refreshing spring rains that overnight had turned the countryside incredibly lush. We stayed by the fire, watching the merry red flames crackling over the wood. We roasted marshmallows with my grandfather until we felt like we were about to drop. We returned to the 4-man tent we had pitched earlier in the morning, with our grandfather's help, of course. I found it rather exhilarating camping out of doors with my 2 best friends. Once we got into the tent, we literally flopped down into our sleeping bags. We were dog-tired, we were. But I suspect our minds were busily filled with the excitement of my grandfather's scintillating tales. "Your grandfather tells the best stories," said James. "I wish my grandfather told stories. He's deaf in one ear. He's always very grumpy." I remember hearing my grandfather, sitting by the fire pit, talking quietly to my grandmother, late into the night it was. I found the soft droning tone of their voices, in the background, oddly soothing and reassuring. I drifted off to sleep. Shortly after we retired to our sleeping bag, my grandparents turned in for the night. I know my grandmother had told my grandfather to keep checking up on us during the night, to make absolutely sure we were all right. She was naturally very protective over us, but at the same time she didn't want to sabotage or jeopardize our fun in any way, and wanted us to feel we had a measure of independence. I remember waking up in the middle of the night with quite a start. I could hear a heavy, ponderous footfall walking around our tent. Had I imagined that? At first I felt really afraid, because someone was out there, and I had no idea who or what it was. Then I began to physically relax. How could I be such an idiot? Our grandfather was probably checking up on us. That was what it was. I was about to go back to sleep when I really realized that I needed to answer a call of nature. but there was no way I was going to take a leak on my own. It was too dark outside, and after all those stories my grandfather told us, my confidence was waning. I began to shake my friend James, who certainly didn't appreciate being woken up in the middle of the night so very rudely, and was grumbling and groaning at me for having disturbed him. So there we are. That is the end of part 3. So I can't wait for you to join me tomorrow night. Isn't it such a wonderful story? And we've still got more to hear. So I'm looking forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.